Good morning all. My name is Gregory Metzger and I welcome you all to this webinar. Thank you for taking the time, and I trust that it will be worth your investment in your time to spend 45 minutes with us. Just for those of you that don't know me, I go by the name of Metz. I'm the Regional Manager for First 5 Minutes in Victoria, and I'm also the National Threat and Risk Manager for the First 5 Minutes business. A little bit about my background. I spent a significant number of years in law enforcement and counterterrorism, both at a state and federal level, specialising in counterterrorism, explosive ordnance, hostage incident resolution, VIP protection, search and rescue, and then later on the air crew, air security officers program with the federal police, before spending 4 years in Iraq as the country manager on behalf of the coalition, training over 40,000 Iraqi National Police. I managed a number of security contracts in Afghanistan, spent some time in East Timor before returning to Australia as the general manager for Australia's largest privately owned security company. I then saw the light and joined First 5 Minutes. So I hope you recognise that I've got a little bit of expertise in this field, and I'm certainly open to any questions that you may wish to ask. Before we kick off, just make you all aware that this webinar is being recorded. We will share this recording with all registered attendees. So if you get called away or you want to re-listen to it later on, you can do so just by following the appropriate link. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A or the chat option at the bottom of your screen. Your questions will come up and I will address them at the end of the session prior to signing off. The question I have for all of you, are you appropriately prepared? Now, the heading or the title of our webinar is Ways to Diminish Your Security Risk Profile. Now, in the first instance, we have to recognise whether we do have a security concern. And before I kick off, I want to be really clear that it's not my intention to alarm anyone. It's simply to make people aware, to ensure that people are appropriately informed so that we understand what our threat environment is and how to respond and react appropriately. So I want you to ponder this thought. Are you prepared in your environment, where you work, where you live, during your private life? Are you appropriately prepared for the change in our environment? And I want to share a short story with you. So Rick Riscola was born in 1939 in a township called Cornwall in the UK. It was the first year of the Second World War, and during that time his township was inundated with US soldiers in crisp uniforms, which left a lasting impression upon Rick. And it was his dream to one day be part of that military might. So when he was 17, he joined the UK Parachute Regiment and he deployed overseas prior to attending in Africa, actually, in North Rhodesia, now known as the Zambia Police, as an inspector of police. And during his time in Africa, he actually met a US soldier who specialised in counter-terrorism. His name was Dan Hill, and they struck up a friendship and remained friends for life. When he finished in Africa, Rick returned to the UK, where he joined the Met Police for a number of years. But the pull to the US military and that crisp memory that he had from his childhood remained with him. And it wasn't long before he went over to the US, joined the military and actually graduated as a platoon leader, where he was deployed to Vietnam during the Vietnam conflict. And he very quickly gained a reputation of not leaving anyone behind, caring for his team and ensuring that everyone was appropriately prepared. So once he left that conflict and returned to the US, he left the military, tried his hand at doing some studies. He did 3 degrees in arts, law, and in English. He wrote a book, and then he decided to try his hand at teaching. But it wasn't long before he was pulled back into the paramilitary security lifestyle. And he joined Dean Witter as their security manager. Now, Dean Witter later merged to become Stanley Morgan. And they were occupiers in the South Tower of the World Trade Center, on the 44th floor for that matter. And Stanley Morgan had about 2,867 employees, over which Rick was the chief warden and also the security manager of that building. And things were going all right until in 1988, Pan Am Flight 103 had an explosive device detonated on board overhead Lockerbie. And this made Rick realise that the concern or the threat of terrorism was coming to homeland. It wasn't a conflict that was going to be resolved in foreign lands, and he wanted to be appropriately prepared. He also recognised that the World Trade Center was a significant iconic building in the US and would most likely or very possibly be the target of a terrorist threat. And so he called upon his friend Dan Hill to conduct a security risk assessment. And they walked around the building and they identified that the security was reasonably good. However, they were able to walk into the car park in the basement unchallenged. And Dan advised Rick that if he was to provide or attack the World Trade Center, he would do so by a vehicle-borne improvised explosive device, by driving a vehicle into the basement car park and detonating it. And this concerned Rick to the extent that he identified this to the Ports Authority, who were the owners of the building, and also to Stanley Morgan. However, as is often the case, security is never cheap, and it's an inconvenience, or it's considered an inconvenience, and so nothing was done about it. And lo and behold, in 1993, a vehicle-borne improvised explosive device was actually driven into the North Tower and was actually detonated, killing 6 people and injuring many hundreds. And then during this incident, Rick observed how unorganised and the amount of panic that ensued in the evacuation. And Rick took it upon himself there and then that he would make sure that all of his personnel were appropriately prepared. And from that day onwards, Rick organised emergency evacuation training at random and regularly every 3 to 4 months. And everyone had to partake, so everyone knew exactly how to evacuate. And because he'd had some credibility now, as he'd foreseen this threat, people were listening to him, and he actually managed to change the culture. When they rebuilt the World Trade Center, he got his friend Dan back in, and they walked around the building and they identified it was now a very secure building. But they looked to the heavens and identified that any threat that was possible on this building would have to come from the skies. American Airlines Flight 11 flew into the North Tower on the 11th of September 2001, and we know what happened. And during this incident, the North Tower went into evacuation, but the Southern Tower was advised to stand by. However, Rick took the situation into his own hands, grabbed his megaphone and started to evacuate people. And of the 2,800 plus people, plus about 50 to 100 brokers that were there that day, they all managed to get out safely, bar 6, because Rick had a plan. They had a plan in place, they conducted a security risk assessment, they realised what their gaps were, and they were able to respond appropriately. They were prepared, they had done the appropriate planning. Now, to conclude that story, unfortunately, Rick kept going back into the building, didn't want to leave anyone behind, and his remains were found 2 weeks later. Are you appropriately prepared if you were faced with a similar situation? Well, you should be, to be honest with you. Australian Standards 3745 has been around for nearly 30 years. It came about in 1990 as the Emergency Control Organisation and Procedures for Buildings, Structures and Workplaces. And upon that being released, I identified that a little bit of clarification was required. There was a couple of items that were contentious, and they made some changes in 95 and released an amended version in 2002, where they refined the Emergency Control Organisation and actually came up with appropriate policies and procedures as part of that standard to ensure compliance. We're currently operating under version 2010, which is the planning for emergencies in facilities. And in that version, we've gone a little bit further in relation to PEEPs, which is personal emergency evacuation plans, but also is a broader view of the threats other than fire that we could be faced in the workplace. And that particular standard is under review again, and you will find that in future, there'll be more to do with the actual threat environment and how to deal with and respond to those. So from a fire's perspective, there's a definite culture out there. It doesn't matter where you work or who you represent. Generally, most people know what to do during a beep beep and a whoop whoop alert to evacuate or actually evacuate, because it's a culture that we've developed. However, in the threat environment, we haven't gotten there yet. We're still on our way to developing that culture, and we very much need to. Because in the same sense that the standard has evolutionised, so has our threat environment. And if I take you back to 2002, where we didn't actually have any sort of national threat advisory system. 2002 is when Australians were subjected to the bombing in Bali, and we've lost a number of people. And it was during that period of time that the Australian government decided we needed to come up with a national threat advisory system. And that system was a 4-tiered system: low, medium, high and extreme. And it was released in 2003. Now, if you remember, back in 2003, that's when the Gulf War started. So there was a lot happening in the international world, but not so much at that time in Australia. An Australian government released that advisory system, and we were actually classified at medium. So low, medium, high and extreme were classified at medium, which meant that a terrorist attack on Australian soil was possible. And that's where it remained until 2014. Now, environment changed significantly in 2014. 2014, we had the conflicts in the Middle East really ramp up. We had over 150 people leave our shores to fight in foreign conflicts. We had a number of people that wanted to leave our shores where the Australian government actually took their passports off them. And a point in case is the attack that we experienced in Melbourne in November of last year, that particular offender, he'd had his passport taken off him in 2014 because he had indicated that he wanted to travel overseas to fight in foreign conflicts. So things were happening at that time. The Australian Federal Police reported that their case file number increased sixfold at that time in relation to counter-terrorist concerns that they were dealing with, and the entire environment was changing. And so we were escalated from medium to high, where the terrorist threat level was no longer possible, was considered likely. In 2015, the then Abbott government changed that National Threat Advisory System to the current system that you have on your screen now. It's a 5-tiered system, and we're currently sitting at probable. And often people think, well, probable is only halfway there, so we don't have too much to worry about. And again, without being alarmist, the reality is the reason we're at probable is because ASIO and law enforcement agencies here in Australia have identified individuals and groups of people within our shores which are currently here with an intent and a capability to carry a terrorist attack. So intent, they want to, capability, are able to, and that's why we're currently at probable and we have to appropriately prepare. Now, fortunately for us, the Australian government has come to our aid. On the 20th of August in 2017, the then Prime Minister Turnbull released Australia's strategy for protecting crowded places from terrorism. This was a publication released by the Australian and New Zealand Counter-Terrorist Committee and is there to assist us in being able to deal with and respond accordingly to that changed threat environment. And this document is available to each and every one of you. It's open source information on the internet available for you to review. And however, when I travel around the country and conduct this presentation, I often ask for a show of hands of how many people are actually aware that this document exists, and the majority don't. So I'll reach out to you and ask you to get online, download this document and prepare appropriately. But I'm going to go through some of these points now, some of these strategies or some of these guidelines to assist you, to focus you more in the area that you think you may have a need. And our security risk assessments, our plans and our policies, bomb threat management plans, our chemical procedures plans are all based on this strategy and information released in open source information via the Australian Federal Police. They talk about 4 guidelines in the strategy. They talk about how to deal with, respond to or prepare for hostile vehicle attacks, chemical weapon attacks, improvised explosive attacks, or active armed offender attacks. And I'm just going to touch on each one of them just to make you, again, a little bit aware of why the Australian government has decided that we need to have some knowledge in this area. Hostile vehicle attacks, using vehicles as a weapon. Vehicles are easily to come by. Most of us have 1 or 2 in the garage or out the front. You can hire them, you can easily steal them. You don't attract any attention when you're driving down the road in a vehicle. So it's a weapon of choice that's easily obtainable and easily accessible. And many of us would relate to hostile vehicle attacks in relation to the attacks that we've seen overseas and also here in Australia. But the reality is hostile vehicle attacks have been around since the time of vehicles, basically. And just a quick story to put this into perspective, because, you know, most people that I talk to, again, they align hostile vehicle attacks with the current terrorist threat that we face. But going back as far as 1973, a young lady by the name of Olga Hepner-Rabova was a truck driver. That's what she had a job. And she was 22 years of age at that time. When she was born in 1951, she was born into quite a normal family. Her mother was a dentist and her father was a banking clerk. But unfortunately for Olga, midway through her teenage years, she had some struggles with life. She tried to take her life and she was institutionalised for a while. And after she received the medical attention, she couldn't hold down too many jobs, but the one job she could hold down was that of truck driver. And on the 11th of July, 1973, she actually sent a letter to a number of media outlets. And in those letters she wrote, and these letters were found later on after the incident, she actually wrote that as a result of the grief that she's felt throughout life, somebody had to pay for her suffering. And she had to make a choice whether she would take her life or take the lives of others as punishment for the suffering that or the struggles that she's faced. And she decided that she would take it out on the community. And so she didn't have any training. She had no weapons, so to speak, at her disposal, but she did have a truck. And she decided that on the 11th of July, 1973, that she would actually identify a tram stop that's attended by a lot of elderly. The tram stop is at the bottom of a hill. She had a heavy truck and she recognised that if she drove down the hill and gained speed, she'd be able to cause a lot of death and a lot of casualties. And on that particular day, she was actually driving down the hill on the approach, and she thought that there weren't enough people there. And she actually drove around the block and had a second go at it. And she subsequently killed 12 people and injured many others and was arrested for that offence. Just as a side note of interest, she was the last female to be executed by way of hanging in the Czech Republic. The point I'm making, though, that's a long time ago. As a matter of fact, that's my birth year, so I know how long ago it was, a long time ago. But since then, hostile vehicle attacks have developed significantly. And the reason for that is because they've been promoted as such in propaganda material released by current terrorist cells around the world. So Al-Qaeda have a magazine called the Inspire magazine. ISIL have a propaganda magazine or publication called Romania. And in both of those publications, they've promoted vehicles to be used as weapons. As a matter of fact, the Inspire magazine talks about using vehicles as a weapon as far back as October 2010. And if you remember, or you may remember, one of the most significant hostile vehicle attacks in the world was the attack in Nice, in France, during Bastille Day celebrations, where a young male offender hired a 19-tonne truck and drove into the crowd of people, killing 384 odd people at that particular incident. And, that particular incident actually brought to the fore how serious and how effective vehicle attacks were. And I should do a correction. It was actually injured 434 people, but killed 86 people. But the entire incident was over in less than 5 minutes. And we've had other attacks in the UK and Germany since. And we mustn't forget the attacks that we've had here in Australia. 20th of January, Dimitris Gargasolas killed 6 people in Bourke Street, and Said Nouri in Flinders Street on the 21st of December of the same year. Now, neither of those two incidents, admittedly, were classified as terrorist incidents. But the point I'm trying to make to you, it doesn't matter what the ideology is. It's the fact that hostile vehicle attacks or vehicles being used as a weapon is a concern that we need to be prepared and responsive to. And fortunately for us, the guidelines to hostile vehicle attacks in crowded places, as released by the government, gives a number of indicators, and a security risk assessment can very quickly identify the threat of hostile vehicle attack at your business and also what is available to you to diminish that threat. And hostile vehicle attacks are one of the easiest things to prepare against in relation to all the other attacks. Through crime prevention, through environmental design, which, for example, the City of Melbourne has enacted, would very quickly be able to deal with hostile vehicle attacks. One of the other concerns they talk about is improvised explosive devices. Now, improvised explosive devices is still a preferred weapon of terrorist and criminal elements throughout the world. They can be easily built, they can be quickly deployed, they can be activated or detonated remotely. They cause a lot of grief, a lot of harm, and they cause a lot of fear in people. So it's still an obvious choice. And if we look at our history, there are numerous examples that I can relate to, but I'll just mention a few of them around Australia for your interest. So in 1978, the Commonwealth Heads of Regional Government meeting was conducted in Sydney at the Hilton Hotel, and a device was placed in a garbage bin which actually detonated when it was being emptied by garbage collectors, killing 2 garbage operators and 1 police officer. It was as a result of that the Australian Federal Police came about. It was also a result of that each state and territory police has a counter-terrorist unit, which was set up under the Standing Advisory Committee for the Protection Against Violence. So my point being is we go back many, many years. A number of our embassies and consulates here in Australia have been hit. We had the judiciary bombing, in Sydney of 80 to 85, where a number of people were killed as a result of a domestic incident. We had Detective Sergeant Jeffrey Bowen, who was seconded to Adelaide from Western Australia, who opened a parcel bomb in 93. Then we had the Russell Street bombing that we should never forget in 1986, which killed Australia's first woman police officer in action. And then we had the 28 letter bombs sent to the ATO by a former ATO worker in 1998. So as you can see, plenty of examples where we've been impacted by an explosive threat or an explosive concern. And often when I talk to people, bomb threats causes them greater concern than anything else. The word bomb seems to instill a lot of fear in people. But again, it's all about having a plan, identifying what your risks are and coming up with a plan to diminish the opportunity for that risk to actually become reality, and then also to minimise or to remove a lot of the consequences or the extent of the consequences. And so you need to have an appropriate bomb threat management plan in place. And if you have a proper plan, then people can get the appropriate education, attention, you conduct appropriate levels of training, and people can respond appropriately to that particular plan. And I just want to rewind back, it's not this big unknown. When it comes to bomb threat management, it's all about understanding the basics. So the basics of a bomb threat is, what are the 4 things that can kill you in a bomb threat? It's heat, it's overpressure, it's shrapnel and fragmentation. And how do you protect yourself? Well, there are 2 things, cover and distance. So overhead and all-round cover and distance. And again, these things are addressed in an appropriate security risk management plan. When it comes to bomb threat management, really there's 2 types of concerns that you have. There's the identification, the location or finding of a particular suspicious package or parcel, and how do you react and respond to that. And again, if there are very clear outlines as to how to respond, then people can basically just go to the manual and follow the lead of that manual. Or when you're dealing with bomb threats as they come through. Most businesses at some stage have actually been impacted by a bomb threat, whether it's a neighbouring property or your property yourself. And often when I speak to people, the response is that our default is simply to evacuate. But the question I pose, what if it's the 2nd or 3rd threat that you've had that day? What if you get the threat every week? Are you simply going to respond by evacuating 3,000-4,000 people every time you get a threat? You need to have a plan. And if you have a plan in place, it will give people the level of comfort that one, you're prepared, and 2, that you can respond appropriately to an improvised explosive threat. So when receiving a bomb threat, is it a specific threat or a non-specific threat? So a specific threat is a blue box under the palm tree at reception. That's a very specific threat. It's now 11 o'clock, it's going to go bang at 12 o'clock. You've got some information to work with. A non-specific threat, and these are the most common and regular occurrences where people ring up and say, there's a bomb in your building, and they hang up. So how do you react and how do you respond to them? Well, again, it's about having a bomb threat management plan in place. So there's a number of things you can do, 4 things specifically you can do when you get a bomb threat. One is to do nothing. Now, we never recommend that you don't do anything. You've got to do something. At the very least, you want to report and record the incident. But most likely, you're going to conduct what's called a white level inspection or a discrete search, where you search the areas and then make a determination as to whether evacuation is suitable or necessary. The 3rd option is to search and evacuate concurrently. And the 4th option is to immediately evacuate. And again, in a bomb threat management plan, that would be exactly identified as to what you would do at what time. Now, who are the best people to do a search? And generally, when we ask around the room, everyone sort of points at somebody else or looks at somebody else because nobody wants to say, oh, I'm the best person. But the best person is actually the individuals in their workspaces. They are familiar with their workspace. They know what's out of place. They know what should be there and what should not be there. I can walk into my office and within 10 seconds identify anything that's out of place. You couldn't do the same in my office and I couldn't do the same in your office. So the best people to conduct searches are the people that are familiar with the environment, but they need to be appropriately trained. So they need to be trained in search techniques. Now, they're not going to be turned into the world's best searchers, but they need to have an understanding of how to search and what to search for and what to be aware of if they happen to find something that's suspicious. Again, a bomb threat management plan will very clearly identify that. So your searches, what would they do first? Well, you'd search all your public access areas. They're the places that any sort of threat element can get to easiest. They're also the places that most likely you need to pass through. And we have the least observation or awareness of those areas. So we search public spaces first. We search all of our evacuation routes second. Our entry and exit points third. Our assembly area fourth. And then all the other security areas thereafter. So again, it's all about having a process that people can follow. And then we prioritise the areas that are searched. We consider soak time. So when I'm talking about soak time, a lot of people often say, well, if you've got a time, if somebody's rung up and said the bomb's going to go off at 12 o'clock, when do you have to be out by? The international standard is that if you're given a time in an explosive incident, you do plus minus 20 minutes. So 20 minutes prior to the stated activation, everyone needs to be out and safe. And until 20 minutes after any potential activation, people aren't allowed to be back in. So that gives you some idea. Again, all of those things, they're second nature to people like me, but they're often new information for the likes of the community. So a bomb threat management, a security risk management plan, all of those concerns will address those issues for you. Moving on, chemical attack. Now, often this is where I see people going, well, that's never going to happen here. That only ever happens overseas, doesn't it? Well, it's more likely to happen overseas, but it can happen here as well. And when we talk about chemical attacks, we talk about chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear, and hazardous wastes. They're the 5 things that are usually encompassed in a chemical concern. Now, I'm not going to address the nuclear one because if we have to start talking about a nuclear plan, then I'm probably not the person for it. Radiological, difficult to develop, difficult to deploy. So again, due to time limitation, we're not going to touch on that one. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the chemical concern, the biological concern, and the hazardous concerns, because these are things, again, that we need to plan for, train for, and be able to respond accordingly to. So in a chemical situation, what am I talking about there? I'm talking about nerve agents, blood agents, your choking, your blister, and your riot agents. So to put that into perspective, chemical agents are classified in relation to how they impact the person or the body. So nerve agents attacks the nervous central system. So we're talking about sarin, we're talking about VX, we're talking about Novichok. You will have all heard about those in the news. Sarin, obviously in Syria, VX and Novichok came up with the Skripal father and daughter, the double agents in the UK that were attacked. They were attacked with what was alleged to be Novichok, and VX was used in Malaysia on one of the North Korean people that left the country. So again, it is out there and it does exist, but surely it would never surface in Australia, would it? Well, if you remember the Tokyo subway attack in 1995, it was an attack that was instigated by a doomsday cult group, Shinriko. So they were a Japanese cult who had, previous to the subway attack, already conducted a chemical attack. But most of us remember the Tokyo subway attack. And in that attack, they attacked 5 train lines. And there was 10 people that took 10 or 12 bags of liquid sarin onto the trains, and they punctured those bags with sharpened umbrellas prior to getting off the train. And what they did is it actually killed 13 people, 12 on the day and 1 subsequently, and injured hundreds of people permanently and affected thousands on the particular day. Now, how's that relevant to us in Australia? Well, when the investigators looked into this cult, into Shinriko, and looked into the cult leader by the name of Shoko Asahara, they identified that he had previously, and a lot of his followers in '93, actually come to Australia. They'd come to Australia and they were actually picked up by customs because of the number of the type of equipment that they were trying to bring in. Anyway, they were allowed entry and subsequently bought a cattle station called Bunjawan Station in Western Australia. And they were there for a little while doing God knows what. However, after the incident, when the authorities attended this particular cattle station, they found a number of deceased sheep, and those sheep had died as a result of sarin inhalation. So, whether it was the same strain or not really sure, but the fact of the matter is that sarin has been developed here in Australia in the past. And I always, say to people that to deploy something is much, much easier than to develop it, and it's actually been developed here. So we should be aware of that. Again, it's not about being an alarmist. It's about just making you aware of the reality of the situation. And this is probably one of the reasons why Australia's strategy for protecting crowd from terrorism actually incorporates chemical weapons attack. The other one I want to touch on very quickly is hazardous materials. So if you remember in January of this year, a number of our embassies and consulates, Sydney, Canberra and Melbourne, were sent packages with the writing, "Don't open, asbestos enclosed." That's called a hazardous material attack. And, we need to be aware of that. Biological concerns, generally we talk about anthrax. And again, a lot of people would not know that we have an area in New South Wales called the anthrax belt. It's the anthrax belt. It's a cattle area where anthrax naturally grows in the soil. And a number of cows have died in that area from that. 2 people have died from anthrax in Australia, but not as a result of terrorist attack, but rather accidental inhalation in natural environments. However, we've never had any anthrax here. We've never had an anthrax attack here. But 2 weeks after 9/11, if you recall, there was an anthrax attack in the US, and 5 people died and numerous other people were injured. And during that incident, I was actually in law enforcement, and we actually went from job to job to job, day after day, with anthrax threats, where organisations, education facilities, corporations were receiving anthrax threats. And often they were actually getting letters or parcels that contained white powder, which was always things like caster sugar or flour, nothing that was actually of any risk. However, the point being is, even though there was never any anthrax sent around, the threats went around to many corporations and impacted a lot of businesses. And those businesses that had a plan were able to respond to the threat, react accordingly, and then get on with business. Whereas those that didn't have a plan, the entire business came to a standstill, certainly for that particular day of the threat. So whether we've had it here in real or whether we've just had threats, we need to have a plan so we can respond and react appropriately. And just very quickly, when it comes to chemical attack, just remember 3 words: remove, 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 and that'll be part of your plan. So remove people, from the contaminated area, remove any clothing that's considered contaminated very carefully off the person, and remove contaminants from the skin by way of washing with cold water. So just remember, just a quick insight into how to respond to a chemical attack. The final one is active armed offender threat. Now, active armed offenders or active threats used to be referred to as active shooters. But in Australia's strategy, we talk about active armed offenders because the threat is so much more than just firearms. It's edged weapons, it's vehicles, it's explosives, it's the whole lot. It can incorporate any or all of those. And so we talk about the active armed offender threat. And it's important here to have a quick look at the definition of active armed offender, which is an individual actively engaged in killing as many people as possible and demonstrates their intention to continue to do so while having access to further victims. So the solution or the response is actually in the definition. In order to try and minimise the number of people that are harmed by an active threat environment, we need to decrease the amount of time that people are exposed to a threat, and we need to decrease the number of people that are exposed to a threat, and we need to do that as quickly as possible. So time is of the essence. And in all those hostile vehicle attacks that I spoke about before, in most cases they only travelled for 50, 100, 150 metres. It was over in 2 to 5 to 10 minutes. Active threat environments, the same thing. And just very quickly, the FBI researched 168 active shooter incidents in the US between 2000 and 2013, and they identified in those incidents that 69% were over in less than 5 minutes, and of those, 36% were over in less than 2 minutes. So the point I'm making here is you need to be able to recognise a threat and respond accordingly and as quickly as possible to ensure that we minimise casualties. And how do we do that? Well, we can do it through a preventative lockdown, an emergency lockdown, or escape, hide, tell. Very quickly, a preventative lockdown is where you actually recognise an external threat, external to your building, external to your campus. You recognise an external threat and you want to keep that threat out from coming into the building. So you conduct a preventative lockdown. You lock the doors, you barricade the doors, you close the windows, you draw the blinds, you put the lights out. You remove people from public spaces, take them off the ground floor, put them upstairs, remove them from the external windows. You pretend that nobody's home and you don't open the door, don't let anyone in, you don't let anyone out, and you advise the emergency law enforcement services of your lockdown status. Now that's putting it very simply. Again, it's much easier said than actually done, but a security risk management plan will identify how to conduct a preventative lockdown and what you need to do in order to be able to successfully and very quickly conduct a preventative lockdown. An emergency lockdown is the same principle, but the threat's already within. So let's say you have a multi-storey building and the threat is, for argument's sake, on level 1. If we go back to 1986, we had the Queen Street incident, we had the Hoddle Street incidents here in Melbourne. Again, it's a similar scenario. So in the Queen Street one, the offender went up to a particular floor and started harming people. So an emergency lockdown is where the threat's already within, we can no longer do a preventative lockdown, but the threat's not immediately upon us. So let's say it's on level 1, then perhaps the ground floor, people there who become aware of an active threat, they would evacuate, they would escape, hide, tell, which is what we always promote, run away from danger. However, those on levels 2 and 3 and above level 1 may not be able to evacuate. So they would do an emergency lockdown where they would lock down their floor, their workspace, so the threat can't move into their area. So it's the same concept as an emergency lockdown, as a preventative lockdown, but it's an emergency lockdown within the building. And the third level is escape, hide, tell. So Australia's strategy for protecting crowded places from terrorism promotes escape, hide, tell. You may have heard in the UK, they call this run, hide, tell. In the US, they often refer to it as run, hide, fight. There's the acronym of ALICE, alert, lockdown, indicate, counter, evacuate. They're all the same, but in Australia, they promote escape, hide, tell. And so what that means is the threat's immediately upon us. We're in our office or we're in the kitchen or the lounge, wherever we may be in our workspace, and we become aware of an active threat environment. Threat's already within, we can't do a preventative lockdown. It's 10, 15, 20 metres away. We can't do an emergency lockdown. So what can we do? We need to escape, hide, tell. So we always try and run away from danger. That's the most important thing. We escape by whatever methods, crawling, running, sneaking, however we can escape. And whilst escaping, we escape with purpose, knowing where our evacuation points are, knowing where our exit points are and how we can get away, how we can escape. And whilst escaping, we make other people aware of the threat. We don't argue with them, we don't try and convince them, we simply make them aware as we're escaping. And whilst escaping, we're looking for areas of cover and concealment. Cover protects you, concealment hides you. You want both of those. So that's the escape component. We escape from danger, we leave the building, we run to an area of safety, where we can then wait the arrival of law enforcement to brief them accordingly and also to forewarn others not to approach the building. If during our escape, or if we can't escape, we need to hide, then that's another option. So hide means exactly what I talked about in the lockdowns, but it might be at a smaller space. So you might hide, worst case scenario, under a table, out of sight. So you're now concealed, but you haven't got cover. It's not ideal. However, we might be able to hide in a room. So again, if we find a room, we lock the room, we barricade the room, we pull the blinds, we put the lights out, phones on silent, vibrate off, we get on the floor, we protect our head, but we keep our ears open for listening. And at the very first chance we get, we call for help through the phone, 000, we call for help. Escape, hide, tell. Again, those things would be identified through training, through planning. And what's important here very quickly, that unlike AS 3745, which talks about empowering your emergency control organisation who then take charge, in an active threat environment, it's actually every individual that needs to know how to respond. From cleaner to CEO and anywhere in between, people need to recognise the threat and be able to respond accordingly. If you're still not convinced, just very quickly, ASIO and law enforcement have prevented 15 serious terrorist incidents since 2014, 8 in Sydney and 7 here in Melbourne. Everything from people being, plans to take people hostage and behead them publicly, to big attacks such as IED, active threats via firearms, and we had the Etihad incident out of Sydney. So again, we do need to be aware that our environment has changed somewhat. Very quickly, I'll just talk about security because many of you will actually have security teams in your businesses. Security guards used to be employed to be exactly that, to guard people and assets. And then over time, because we always want to bang for our buck, we want to return for our investment, we don't even call them security guards anymore. We call them customer service officers or concierge because, it's more important that they provide that customer experience. But in this changed environment, I recognise the importance that they provide the customer experience, but they also need to know what to do and how to respond in an emergency. So I think we need to rewind the time a little bit. And in Australia's strategy of protecting crowded places, they talk about a partnership of building stronger relationships between government and community, businesses and organisations. It's a two-way relationship. And if we do that, we'll be able to enable better information sharing and guidance. And it's very important. And this particular strategy is an example of the government sharing with us information that we need to know. But just as important is that the communication goes both ways. The National Threat Hotline, 1800 123 400, is a number that you can call if you observe or have any suspicions or concerns. And again, it's important that we're aware of what's available to us so that we can appropriately report any suspicions that we may have. And if I think back to my law enforcement days, it was very rare that I would drive around the corner and be at the right place at the right time to effect an arrest of a crime being committed. In most cases, I was put in that place because a member of the public called the police saying my neighbour's house is being broken into or the car's being stolen. It's the same on the bigger picture. The government relies and requires us to report to them any concerns that we may have, and they in return can advise us appropriately so that we can implement effective protective security. If we do that, then as a community and as a business, we'll increase our resilience and our ability to be able to survive and thrive in this changed environment. So we need to be prepared. And the only way that we're going to be appropriately prepared is to have an understanding of the current environment. We need to be able to plan for it. We need to ensure that we have the appropriate resources available and that we do the appropriate training, exercising and consideration. Everyone, and not just the ECO as I previously provided. The other thing that's very important is prevention, Prevention, as they say, is better than a cure. But how do we do that? Well, we do that through the appropriate degree of risk treatment, again, through identifying what the risks and concerns are in our workspace and how we can appropriately respond to those. And we talk about a hierarchy of controls. So any security risk plan or risk assessment or management plan that's worth its weight in salt will have a hierarchy of controls where they look at security in a layered approach. So we're talking about eliminating the risk, or if we can't eliminate the risk, we need to substitute the risk where we have the same outcome but at a lower risk. We need to come up with engineering controls, so we're talking about physical and electronic there. So physical are things like your perimeter fencing, your entry points, your lighting systems, your access control points from a physical aspect, as well as your security teams and their appropriate training and security training of personnel. We're talking about electronic security responses, again, part of the plan. So that's not only detection, but also access control. So your access controls, your CCTV, your wanding, your magnetometers, those are the things that you will consider in your security electronic space. But of very much importance is your administrative controls. So having appropriate policies and procedures in place that people actually understand and recognise and comply with. It's so important. You can have all the different layers of security in place, but if you're unable to change the culture of the people in your business so that they actually identify any concerns and report them accordingly, then those layers are going to fail at some stage. So it's about having the appropriate hierarchy of controls in place. Again, if people know what to do, if they know where they can gain that information, they have the appropriate level of comfort to be able to respond and react accordingly. And if they do that, then they will be vigilant on your behalf. So there has to be the existence of a plan. That plan needs to be educated, it needs to be understood, it needs to be current, it needs to be correct, and it needs to be trained to. And if we do that, we're naturally going to change the culture of the people in our workspace. This will ensure that they will be vigilant, so that they seek concerns, that they identify concerns and that they report them, that they don't just simply ignore any issues that they may have identified. And if they've had the appropriate level of training, they'll be able to recognise the threat. Because as I said before, remember, time is of the essence. So in IED threats, active threats, hostile vehicle attacks, chemical weapons, time is of the essence. An appropriate plan that's understood and responded to will make all the difference in ensuring the safety of people in your workspace. And if they do that, they'll be able to respond accordingly, so you have a smooth transition between responding to a threat and recovering from the threat, so that your people are appropriately trained, they're appropriately counselled and supported, that they're appropriately debriefed after an incident. And if you do that, you're going to not only protect the people, but you will protect the business, ensuring that the brand is protected and that you have sufficient levels of resilience throughout the business. This is how we need to respond to the changes in the threat environment. So in summary, be aware, again, not to be alarmist, but be aware that the environment has changed. You need to recognise that fact. And the culture that has been delivered throughout Australian Standards 3745 in Australia, we need a similar culture in the threat environment. The same way that you put your seatbelt on in the morning when you drive to work, it's not because you expect to have an accident. You do that because that's the safe thing to do. Having a plan, understanding that plan and being able to respond within that plan is what will give you the appropriate levels of resilience. We need to know how to prevent so that we can appropriately prepare, have the ability to respond and the capability for a quick recovery. The message here is to be alert and to be aware, to be prepared, but certainly not to be alarmed. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for listening. I hope that you got some value, you got some benefit out of it. Again, it's just simply to basically make you aware of what's available to you, what resources are available, and certainly it'd be amiss of me to remind you that here at First 5 Minutes we pride ourselves on being on the forefront of emergency preparedness, both in the AS 3745 space and the active threat space. So by all means, if there are any questions, I'll have a look and take them up now. But if I can assist now or later, you have my details, please reach out to me. I can come and speak to you in person. I travel around Australia regularly, or there's always emails and phones. As I said, if I can be of assistance, please reach out to me. I wish you all a great day, and again, thank you for your time. Bye.